Well, I think Aspie's doing some good work here in laying bare some of the facts around how China's United Front operates, the reach, the extent, the intricacy of some of its dealings, the fact that the linkages between what on the surface seem to be benign groups bringing together the Chinese diaspora and community in Australia, but actually can be used for intelligence purposes and for political warfare purposes. So the most important thing is to be aware of it, to be on the watch out for it. And certainly, I think over the last couple of years, our parliament's become much more attuned to the way that the Chinese Communist Party tries to extend its influence globally using the United Front and related groups.
Indeed, and that's taken the form of legislation. And I guess it's also instructive because clearly the attitude Australia has taken on this has upset China. This report, in many ways, highlights that we're just calling out what's obvious.
Yeah, look, we are going to have a relationship with China for many decades to come. The key is to set boundaries for what is acceptable to Australia and what isn't. And anything that challenges Australian sovereignty is problematic. Any sort of intelligence activity or any influence activity in Australia that's not legitimate is problematic for that relationship. So for Australia to call it out, for researchers like Aspie's Alex Josky to point out the linkages and make transparent those linkages, I think is ultimately a good thing. It means that business, universities, private companies dealing with China will be much more aware of the ways they can go off path and they can be led astray.
Mm. Yeah, always important for government to play that hand to be able to issue these warnings. Turning to Donald Trump, interesting to read he's calling on essentially a new strategy from some of his aides. This was supposed to be the time when he was beginning to highlight flaws in Joe Biden, for example, and also campaigning on the economy. Clearly that's not going to work. What do you think we're going to see? I mean, right now he'd probably lose an election, but that's not all that relevant given how far things away are. What sort of tack could he switch to?
Look, he's got time. Every time Trump's called for a new strategy, he's ended up doubling down on his instincts, doubling down on what he promised during the 2016 campaign, and his policies have been remarkably consistent. He talked about tariffs on China. He implemented tariffs on China. He talked about reducing troop presence. He's done that. He's done that again this weekend by reducing the number of troops in Germany. He talked about prioritising American interests, onshoring manufacturing. He's done that. So it's hard to see what a new strategy could look like. He could become a more ideological president. He could start to adopt an anti-communist rhetoric against China even more strongly. He's started to test some attack lines on Joe Biden using that. Some of the PACs supporting the president are very critical on Joe Biden for his China linkages. So that's one way we could see him intensify his rhetoric. It is a bipartisan issue, and it would be something that people could rally around. The economy is going to be a less attractive a proposition for the president to point to. It's just too unreliable at the moment. Unemployment hasn't been as bad as expected in the US, but it's only a couple of months into this COVID crisis, so we're yet to see the damage it's wrought on America's economy.
You mentioned more ideological. What about some of the traditional sort of fault lines? Abortion, obviously that's normally more a case of what happens with Roe v. Wade, but Donald Trump can point to a Supreme Court appointment, I suppose. Gun control, I mean, are we going to see a few of those familiar buttons hit maybe?
Look, potentially, and Trump has to lock in that Christian right. They were a pivotal force in coming out for him in the last election. He needs them to come out for him again in this election. And we have seen some of those wavering. We saw a significant editorial column in one of the major evangelical magazines. I think it was late last year, criticising the president. That could be the signs of a shift in that voter base for him. A lot of the work that he needed to do for that group has already been done with the Supreme Court appointments, as you point out, but also the many federal court appointments that he's made as well. I mean, he has reshaped America's judiciary, but those appointments are largely complete. So he'll need to have something else that he can offer that group other than instability and rambling press conferences.